Thanks to everyone for joining us. My name is Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director of POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. And we're happy to have this event this morning in conjunction with the release of this report. I hope everyone had a chance to pick up a copy of the report on the way in. This is the eighth consecutive year that our organization has put out this publication, which seeks to examine the federal budget and appropriations for the year, kind of look at the funding and assistance for the Middle East and North Africa, focusing especially on the impact on the prospects for democratic reform, for democracy, for human rights across the region. This project is supported by the Heinrich Böll Foundation. We're very appreciative of their support. This is sort of the longest running partnership that our organization has, and we're very excited about our partnership with the Böll Foundation and about this project and this report. This report obviously is, there's a lot of effort that goes into this report. My colleague Cole Bockenfeld and I are the authors whose names are on the report, but it's really a team effort and involved the support of a lot of our colleagues in our office. Probably half of our office were involved one way or another in putting this together. I'd like to especially thank Todd Ruffner and Alex Russell, both of whom put a lot of time and effort into getting the report in the shape that it's in. As I mentioned, we've published this report for the last 8 years. We always try to incorporate kind of feedback and comments that we get on the report each year into the report the following year. A lot of that feedback often comes in the form of things that we could have gone into more detail on, or that we could have said a little bit more about. And so as a result, the length of this report has kind of grown over the years. This year, it's up to about 68 pages, so we're happy with several of the additions this year, and we hope that this report will be useful to those in our field who are interested in tracking what's happening in terms of U.S. funding and budget for the region. In putting the report together, we go through the budget documents that are made available publicly in February and March, and then we complement those with a long list of interviews, discussions with people here in D.C., people in various branches of the U.S. government, people here on Capitol Hill, as well as people outside of government who work at various organizations in the field of democracy and human rights, as well as discussions with people across the region, our contacts and democracy advocates across the region. Before I get into some of the kind of findings and conclusions of this report, I'd like to introduce our other speakers. My co-author on the report, Cole Bockenfeld, is the advocacy director here at POMED. And then we're excited to have two speakers that have both recently left the U.S. government, and we're happy to have their views and comments on some of our findings. Nazanin Nash is now visiting policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. She recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department, where she oversaw the Middle East Partnership Initiative, MEPI, as well as the Office of Regional and Multilateral Affairs, and we're excited to have her with us this morning. And then Tom Melia is now the Executive Director at Democracy International, which he has joined upon just leaving the State Department in March, where he was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State within the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I would add that before he went into the State Department, in 2010, he was a member of our board, and so we've had a long relationship with Tom and are happy to have him here commenting now that he's back outside of government on our analysis of what the U.S. government is and isn't doing in the region. One quick note before I get into kind of some of the substance and details on the report. As I mentioned, this report always draws on the publicly available budget documents. One thing that was a bit disappointing that's been the case in some other years as well is that when the budget document, the federal government submitted its budget request for fiscal year 2016 in February and March. They released documents that include sort of the latest estimates of spending from previous fiscal years. This year that included the spending for fiscal year 2014, but did not include any estimate for fiscal year 2015. That's for a variety of reasons, including several large initiatives that were kind of required to have funds spent on them in the last half of last year, and so essentially the administration was not able to have its numbers and estimates for FY15 available. We did our best to acquire whatever information we could about current levels of spending, but it makes it a little bit more challenging to look at trends and comparisons between the budget request for FY16 and the existing levels of spending. In the charts and tables in our graphs, we generally used the FY15 numbers that were requested a year ago, with some notes where we expect changes from those numbers. In terms of general trends that we see, the first thing that I would just comment on is that obviously over the past year we've seen the emergence of the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria, and really the fight against ISIS and similar sort of radical groups elsewhere, as well as violence that has erupted into full-scale conflict in places like Yemen and Libya, have really dominated the U.S. government's thinking over the past year. And the result has been a shift even more than in the past in favor of looking at the region through the lens of military and security issues, and that a lot of our issues that we focus on, more of democracy and human rights, as a result get a little bit less of an emphasis. And in reality, this is nothing new. For as long as we've been doing this report, or even longer than that, the overwhelming majority of U.S. assistance to the region has been in the form of military and security assistance. But what we have seen is that that balance has shifted only even further in that direction. For many of us observers, that's a little bit disappointing. Following the uprisings that erupted across the region in 2011, there was a lot of rhetoric in Washington, including from the U.S. government and from those here on the Hill, about the need to sort of rebalance aid and to be more supportive of the economic side, as the protest movements in the region were seen as the result of not only political repression, but also of lack of economic opportunity, including comments by then Senator John Kerry, and of course now Secretary of State, who called in March or April of 2011, he spoke publicly and called for a sort of rebalancing of aid in the economic direction. Unfortunately, in the now 4 years that have passed since then, we've really seen the opposite. And in 2010, where 73% of foreign assistance to the region was military and security assistance, that's actually gone up just a little bit and is now up at 76%. On the other side, looking at the funding for democracy and governance in the region, in 2010, it constituted 8% of all funding, all U.S. assistance to the region, and now that's actually gone down quite a little bit to 6%. So that shift, is reflected in U.S. assistance to the region, but it also, even more clearly, is just simply reflected in priorities and devotion of staff and energy and resources, and a lot of the issues of democracy and governance in the region seem to be getting drowned out by sort of urgent attention on military and security issues. Another comment that I would make is that in combating these military and security threats in the region, the administration is increasingly relying on allies in the region, and which are primarily authoritarian allies such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. And the result of this sort of increased reliance and partnership with authoritarian regimes in the region in order to combat military and security threats has resulted in a sort of decrease of an already very limited willingness to pressure these allies or to take any steps that might upset these allies. And that certainly includes any steps on the side of political reform and democracy. In this report 2 years ago, I wrote in 2014, in the report for fiscal year 2014, written in 2013, I commented on a similar trend and noted that I was somewhat surprised that following the uprisings in the region and the political transitions that were underway, I noted, surprisingly, the administration appears to be even more willing to take actions that may antagonize allied governments in the region than was the case before the 2011 uprisings. And I think this is clearly even more pronounced today than it was 2 years ago when I comment on that with some surprise. And this unwillingness to take actions that are unwelcome by our allies in the region, including non-democratic allies, has a number of consequences for the way that the U.S. government engages in the region and attempts to support democracy and governance. There's been a clear crackdown across the region on civil society by many governments in the region. Many of you are familiar with the crackdown and prosecution of civil society and NGO staff in Egypt. There have been similar actions taken across the region, including in the United Arab Emirates, in Morocco, in many other countries across the region. And really, this crackdown has had a clear impact on many of the democracy advocates working across the region. It's also had a clear impact on the U.S. government and its ability to support democracy and governance in the region. One of the key State Department offices in the region for supporting civil society was the MEPI office that was located in Abu Dhabi. It's been forced to close down. It's in the process of closing now and will be relocated, and it's been very constrained in its ability to work because of the unwelcomeness of the UAE government. And in general, we've seen sort of quite a bit more caution than in the past by the U.S. government in terms of supporting independent civil society. I think both motivated by a desire not to support groups that may antagonize the host government and fray that relationship, and then also a sort of out of an understandable desire not to endanger civil society recipients of U.S. assistance. And so I think that the U.S. government is really struggling to adapt and to be able to continue to support civil society in a worsening environment marked by strong crackdowns across the region. We also note in the report a couple of troubling bits of language in the federal budget request that accompanies the budget numbers. And one of those, for the second consecutive year, the U.S. administration budget request includes a stripping of language that's been in the Budget and Appropriations Acts since 2009 globally, and before that it was since 2004 in reference to Egypt. And this is language known as the Brownback Amendment, which prohibits the U.S. government from allowing foreign governments to have prior approval over either the recipients of U.S. democracy and governance funding or the nature of such programs. This year, a year ago in the budget request, that language was the administration requested that language be removed entirely. This year, rather than suggesting it being removed entirely, it suggests that it be replaced by language that mirrors the President's Memorandum on Civil Society from September 2014. It's language that expressed very similar sentiment to the Brownback language. It says that the U.S. government should oppose efforts to constrain civil society, and it's language that is clearly in support of expressing support for independent civil society. Nonetheless, we are concerned that this would give the government the freedom in particular cases, if it chose, to give this sort of prior approval to foreign governments. And although it says, the new recommended language says that the U.S. government should oppose through appropriate means efforts by foreign governments to restrict civil society. This change of the word from shall, the previous language said that the existing language says that the U.S. government shall not allow foreign governments prior approval. The new language simply says that they should oppose through appropriate means efforts to restrict civil society, and we would fear that this would open the door for the U.S. government to kind of give too much authority to foreign governments. And we also think that just simply the proposal of this language, which we hope will not be adopted by Congress, sends a signal of kind of diminished support for civil society. We're also a little surprised and disappointed to see that the U.S. budget request for the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor has been steadily decreasing. Fortunately, the overall funding for DRL has not been going down as much as the requests have been. DRL is one of the few institutions that the Congress has been granting more funds than the administration has been requesting. But again, I think that this diminished request sends a signal, kind of negative signal of the administration's support for democracy and human rights globally. Another trend that we see across the region is an increasing focus in U.S. democracy and governance programming on governance at the local level rather than the national level. An increasing emphasis on programs of different kinds, including programs working with local elected councils, municipal councils, and local government bodies, as well as programs working with NGOs and civil society, encouraging them and building their capacity to engage their local governments. And I think this shift is the result of several factors. One, which I've already mentioned, is I think the desire in some cases to avoid antagonizing the national governments that are U.S. allies. I think there might be a perception. I think that there is a perception in some cases that the authoritarian national governments in the region are more comfortable with work that's done to encourage governance at the local level as opposed to the national level. In addition, there are countries in the region in which national politics have really stagnated, including places like Lebanon and the West Bank and Gaza, where national elections have been repeatedly postponed and are not currently scheduled. But on the other hand, there's more opportunities and activity perceived at the local level. In addition, there is the sort of one positive example in the region, Tunisia, where there's actually been progress at the national level, including the writing of the Constitution, as well as the holding of successive national elections. And now there's, as a result of that progress, there's ability to shift to the local level. In other places like Libya and Yemen that have been overtaken by violence and have essentially seen national governments collapse, the local governments are seen as an opportunity. So this is a trend that we've really noted region-wide, which we think could be a positive opportunity. We think that in the medium and long term that this support for governance and citizen engagement at the local level could be an important part of building democracy from the ground up. I would just add that in the long term, if these programs are to be successful and bring real democratization in the region, we'd like to see them accompanied by efforts to encourage the national government to really empower these local institutions. There is, in some cases, a danger that if citizens are really encouraged, including by foreign-funded programs, to engage with elected officials at the local level. In some countries in the region, the local municipal councils are elected but hold very little power, and decisions that they made are routinely overruled by government officials in the capital. And if this situation remains and you have citizens encouraged to engage their local government and then they don't see that engagement having any impact, it could lead to some kind of disillusionment with the democratic process. And so we hope that moving forward, that this attention and extra support for governance at the local level will be accompanied by efforts to empower these local government institutions. I will comment on one country in particular before turning to Cole. I've described that the U.S. government. In a sense, I mean, there is evidence that many inside the U.S. government are still interested in supporting democracy and governance in the region, but these issues receive less attention in the past than they have, a few years ago, and are sort of limited by this strong desire to avoid antagonizing repressive allies in the region. This does leave sort of one clear opportunity for U.S. support in the region, because there is one government, which I mentioned, which there has been real progress, and one government in the region which is not repressive and authoritarian, and that is really receptive to outside support for democracy and governance, and that's obviously Tunisia. We do comment in the report that we're very pleased to see what we consider to be a long overdue increase in the aid requested bilaterally for Tunisia, up to about $134 million. That's about double what was requested a year ago. We think that's important. We hope that this trend will continue. We hope, obviously, here in just about, 30 or 40 minutes from now, President Essebsi from Tunisia is visiting, and he'll be meeting with President Obama at the White House this morning here during this event, and I'll have a joint press appearance in which they'll be announcing things that they reach agreement on, which we hope will include a multi-year MOU governing assistance, as the U.S. has with countries such as Israel and Jordan and Egypt. We really think that Tunisia is, obviously a unique opportunity in the region. And given the context, it is the sort of one place where the U.S. can unabashedly support democracy and governance and support a democratic transition without either having the negative consequences that come with pushback from an authoritarian ally, and it also doesn't have we can have a strong relationship with the Tunisian government and strong bilateral support, including security assistance and economic assistance, in a way that isn't empowering a repressive government that's likely to lead to radicalism and negative consequences that result from repression across the region. So I will leave my remarks there, and I will turn now to Cole, who will comment on several of our other key conclusions from the report.
All right. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. First, let me just reiterate, as Steve mentioned, that this report is really a product of a lot of people's effort, and in particular, I want to express my deep gratitude to Todd Ruffner and Alex Russell for their support. It wouldn't have been possible. I want to just focus on a few of the other broader trends in the policy and in the region, as well as a couple other countries in the region. But of course, I note that we sort of have country sections, I think, on 10 or 11 different countries. So if I don't discuss the one that you're interested in, please feel free to raise it during Q&A, and we'll be happy to talk about it in more detail. The first thing I want to note this year that we found and sort of want to praise and give credit to is another sort of overdue step we feel in the assistance process to the region, that there are sort of new efforts to regularize assistance. For years after the uprisings in 2011, there was really a sort of reactive ad hoc approach where administration officials and Congress really had to scramble to pull together resources to respond to the events in so many different countries. And that trend persisted for years and really, I think, made difficult those that are working on those countries to have a sort of set idea of how much money they would have to spend in that country, what kind of programming, what kind of priorities they could support, and of course create some sort of competition over resources from some of these flexible pots. And so what you've seen this year is a shift away from that approach, sort of using these multi-country mechanisms towards sort of more regular bilateral accounts. This is particularly evident in Libya and Syria. In Libya, we noticed this year that in the FY16 request, there's a $20 million bilateral request, which, albeit small comparatively for the region, is about triple the FY15 level. In Syria also, the request in FY16 is $255 million. This is about a 65% increase, if approved, over the FY15 numbers, and a huge portion of that, about $115 million, would be set aside for democracy and governance work. I do want to caution that, of course, the numbers, at face value are a bit misleading, that in some sense they don't represent sort of massive increases of assistance to these countries, but it does represent a more systematic, predictable approach to those countries that we feel will sort of make the assistance and the policy more effective in that place. Another place we've seen this sort of regularizing assistance is over the past few years we've noted multiple attempts by the administration to create these sort of multi-country flexible accounts. Years ago, it was the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund, Middle East Response Fund, Middle East Initiative, these sort of big-ticket pots of money that people could draw from to respond to unexpected sort of developments in the region. As those have been phased out, as I mentioned, a lot of this has been pushed into the bilateral accounts. And then one other sort of increase that we noted this year is an office within USAID known as the Middle East Regional. The Middle East Regional Office is sort of a successor to an office that had long been in Cairo, known as the Office of Middle East Programs. When that staff was evacuated in late summer, fall of 2013 for security and reasons in the country, this office was sort of set up to inherit and sort of develop from that platform. The budget for this office has sort of quietly increased over the last few years. Then in FY12, the OMEP received about $5 million. It's been quietly increasing until FY16, we see a request for $40 million. So really 8 times that previous budget amount to really empower this office to do a few more things than they have in the past. I do want to mention that, of course, this is sort of a largely sort of budgetary heading and account, that this Middle East Regional is not necessarily confined to a specific location or a certain amount of staff, but does give USA a sort of place of flexible money that they can draw from to respond to crises in the region, to fund different offices where they can house staff from evacuated embassies and so on, to continue programming in volatile or hostile countries. The next point I want to mention, Steve talked about the Brownback Amendment as one of the changes the administration had proposed to the sort of legislative context and the policy that has sort of been long-standing implemented by Congress. Another one of those that we noted this year is a change proposed to Section 7008, otherwise known as sort of the coup law or the coup clause. This long-standing provision of law, it's been in place about 30 years now. It essentially requires the suspension of assistance, direct assistance to a government if an elected government is overthrown by military coup. Of course, this got a lot of attention a couple years ago in Egypt, but has been applied over the years, I think, in nearly a dozen countries. What we've seen this year is there's an attempt, a proposal by the administration to insert a sort of national security interest, national interest waiver to that language. Before, as the law stands now, you can only resume assistance to those countries if a democratically elected government has taken place. If this change were adopted, it would essentially allow the resumption of assistance whether or not that's happened, if it's in the national interests of the U.S. We feel that, of course, sort of inserting this waiver would essentially allow and undermine the application of that law completely, and that, as we've seen with other sort of national security waivers in law, that they're almost routinely used in a way that renders that law meaningless or not effective at all. And so, of course, this had sort of gotten the most attention in Egypt over the last few years, so I want to just make a few comments on Egypt. One of the things we always say about this report is that as much as things change and as much as our attention and the policies and the assistance change to the region, one thing does not is that the Egypt section is the longest, most complicated, most hotly debated part of this report. I think it's about 8 pages out of the 60 this time, because there's really a lot to focus on this year. The first I want to note is Steve mentioned the sort of space for democracy and governance and civil society work in the region is increasingly restricted in unprecedented ways. Nowhere is this more evident than in Egypt. And what we see in the FY16 request is sort of an all-new low of support for democracy and governance programming, about $6 million. This is really a falling off from almost a decade's worth of assistance, where we'd seen generally levels between $25 and $50 million annually for this kind of work. This year, it's really a new low at around $6 million. Part of this is also because what we've looked at with a lot of the attention on Egypt is on the military aid, but also one of the interesting components this year is looking at their economic assistance. What we've seen in Cairo is that there's a huge backlog of funds that have built up over the years based on sort of a difficulty to program that assistance, whether it's democracy assistance. Some of the economic assistance has been held up by a lot of the changes in government and so on. That $460 million at one point was sort of built up, and some of that is sort of starting to be spent down, but there is a huge amount of funds still there left to spend, and that's one reason we see this year an overall decrease in the request for economic assistance to Egypt, $150 million compared to $200 million the previous year and $250 million the year before that. Now, while the ESF is constant at $150 million, or sort of decreasing, sorry, at $150 million, one thing that remains constant, of course, is the military assistance. The request this year, again, renews the $1.3 billion that's been requested for some time now. And of course, this was the big story this year. Just in April, the White House announced sort of lifting the holding of aid to Egypt that had been in place for at least 18 months since then. And so it was a big announcement that we wanted to get into and figure out some of the debates and the implications of that. Now, when that was announced, there were sort of four main components of that announcement. The first was that the president would release withheld items including F-16s, Harpoon missiles, tanks, Apache helicopters, so on, that had been held as a specific list of equipment sort of pending democratic progress in the country. The second, the White House announced that they would continue to renew the assistance level at $1.3 billion and that they would release, of course, all of the funding that had been withheld for the past 18 months or so. The final two components are sort of the reform side of this. And beginning in FY18, the first step the White House announced would be that the U.S. would be revoking Egypt's cash flow financing privilege. This is something we've long focused on as kind of an overdue reform and a real critical first step toward any kind of change or modernizing of the package. And then the fourth component would be sort of changing how Egypt's military aid would be used. And beginning in FY18, all of the equipment purchased that the Egyptians used their military assistance for would have to fall into four categories: counterterrorism, maritime security, border security, and Sinai security. And that anything that didn't fall in those sort of mutually identified security threats, that the assistance should not be used to support. Now, when we did, as Steve mentioned, we do a lot of interviews and discussions around town to try and figure out what's happening behind the numbers and behind the policy. And particularly, we talked to a lot of people about different views on the suspension of assistance to Egypt. And that at the time this was announced, in April 2015, officials had largely divided into two camps, debating about whether or not to lift the holding of aid to Egypt. The first sort of argued that, well, this isn't really having the desired effect. We've held this aid for a long time. We're not affecting Egypt's political trajectory. We should release it. The second sort of said, well, holding this aid is in some ways kind of like a sanction. And sanctions, by their nature, take time to have an effect. And so we need to wait a little bit longer to see if that's true. We would have probably a sort of third component to this. And that, in our view, the sort of suspension of aid was slow in coming, it was incomplete, and half-hearted in its application. We feel like that really completely undermined the impact of that suspension. And what we found in our research and discussions around town, that over this period of suspension, the 18 months from October 2013 to April 2015, was that in fact close to $1.8 billion of Egypt's aid in fact was obligated and did go through during that period, using various legislative authorities and exemptions and so on. And in fact, if you look at the numbers on this, is close to about 90% of what the full rate of Egypt's military assistance would have been. So in fact, the sort of number, the percentage of funds that was actually held back was very small. And the second is sort of beyond this list of items, the specific items of F-16s, tanks, harpoons, and so on, that nothing else was really held back, that a lot of the spare parts and maintenance and other items were delivered to Egypt and fit in a lot of the exempted categories which they had the authority to do. But the proportion that was held back was a very small proportion of the overall package. Third, the sort of suspension we feel was frequently sort of downplayed and undermined by rhetoric from administration officials at the highest levels, suggesting it was a small thing, that it would end soon, that there was a desire to get out of this, rather than sort of use it to the fullest extent possible. And that sort of undermined our leverage in those discussions, undermined the impact of that. And then the final point was that we found that as we watch this over the past couple of years, that decisions to release parts of assistance or to sort of increase and put more money in the account for Egypt's military aid were often based on contract liabilities, the account level, a fear of triggering any of those liabilities, and frankly, how much money was there and how much they needed, rather than the timing being based on political benchmarks, as Congress had intended in a lot of its legislation on this. I do want to come back to these two potentially positive reforms that I mentioned. We've often said over the last few years as we've looked at Egypt's military aid, that sort of the best way to untangle that knot or to start doing so is that you have to start with cash flow financing. We'd seen over the years, as I mentioned, a lot of the difficulties in changing the package and reducing the numbers and trying to get the Egyptians to move away from certain kinds of equipment. We're all tied up in these big multi-year contracts that were funded and financed by cash flow financing multiple years in advance. And that unless you could rescind that and sort of get them on a year-to-year basis, it was very difficult to make those kind of challenges. And so we really welcome this change as a potentially positive step, that beginning in FY18, we can begin to shift that package, begin to modernize the assistance relationship, and get the Egyptians really using and working toward equipment that meets sort of the modern threats that they face. The fourth is these sort of four new categories of assistance that I mentioned: counterterrorism, border security, maritime security, and Sinai. In many ways, we've heard a lot of support for this around town, that this really forces the Egyptian army to prioritize, and it prioritizes what kind of equipment they're looking for in their conversations with defense officials here. And as I mentioned, sort of gets them away from this footing of fighting 20th century land wars to meeting sort of modern asymmetric threats and what kind of equipment they need to do that. The last country I want to mention today is Algeria. We were actually surprised when we were working on this report. I think this is the first time we've written a country section on Algeria, because oftentimes there's not much to say in terms of assistance or political development in that country. And in particular, when President Bouteflika was elected to a fourth term last year, a lot of people looked at this as a continuation of one-party rule, one-man rule, and sort of authoritarianism in that country. But during that campaign, there was a lot of attention given to Bouteflika's sort of failing health and raising real questions of who's actually running the country, would he survive his term, if not, what the plan for succession was. Now, of course, the assistance package to Algeria is a very modest security package. There's not a lot happening there and very little, if any, D&G work happening. But sort of more significant, what we found this year is there's a growing sense among officials that some sort of transition is already underway. And there's kind of a real growing interest in what's happening behind the scenes in Algeria so as to be prepared and so as not to be caught off guard the way they were with a lot of the transitions in 2011. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Cole, turn to Nazanin for her thoughts and comments. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, and good morning. And a huge thank you to Steve and Cole and your team, not just for putting this panel together and the report, but also for all the work that the Project on Middle East Democracy does each year to put this report together. For those of us who watch this space in the region, it's a report that we wait for every year. And for those of you who are encountering it for the first time, know that it is the foundational, authoritative review of U.S. policy and strategy decisions, especially as reflected in a number of the budget decisions. So a huge credit to you and your team, and thank you so much for making this available to our community every year. And one of the things I wanted to focus on, given sort of where Steve and Cole started in really getting into the details of the budget and policy and strategy decisions, is to talk about why we should care about the fact that U.S. democracy assistance is decreasing, but more importantly, has consistently been such a small proportion of assistance to the region. And I would include in that category not just the democracy and governance assistance, but also our economic engagement for the region. So what has it meant that our engagement for the region for the past 60 plus years has been dominated by a security approach, by security alliances, by security cooperation, by an idea that our interests fundamentally can be achieved by sequencing security first and creating space then for the economic and political reforms to follow. And when you look at the history of our engagement, you have to include that that just hasn't happened, that that strategy has not produced results. And so I feel like the conversation, the policy discussions, the engagement with the Hill, the way this debate unfolds is often around a trade-off, like that. Support for democracy and human rights issues are a nice to do, something we can sequence when the circumstances allow, when our allies will permit us. But it's fundamentally central to achieving our goals and securing our interests in the region, which are primarily security interests. So I wanted to talk a little bit this morning about why our approach should change, how it could change, and what it would take to change. So I'll start again, sort of centering on our interests. This group would know that our interests in the region are great and enduring. So despite changes in, our own energy production, global economic security relies on energy security in the Gulf. The counterterrorism, the nonproliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all of these are huge concerns of national import, and they're also huge global security challenges. And so we're going to be engaged in the region for a long time, and that's not going away. But if you make the case, and I think we all would, that those interests rely on security and stability in the region, and then you assess our strategy and our outcomes, you would have to decide that our strategy for the last many decades hasn't been working. So it's easy to sort of look at this moment in time and think of it as a period of crisis. And it does seem that way, like certainly with the advances of ISIS, certainly with the vast majority of countries across the region experiencing the kind of instability and conflict and threats to regimes that you're experiencing, it feels like a moment of crisis. But when you look over the last 4 decades, the region has seen over 60 episodes of regional conflict and violent regime change. 2011 sort of brought that into clear focus. 4 regimes were toppled then. Others unleashed tremendous violence against their populations. And now when you consider a civil war in Syria that's claimed 200,000 lives, ongoing chaotic struggles, entering a second decade in Iraq, and the struggles for power in Libya and Yemen, persistent citizen resistance in Bahrain and Egypt, the march of ISIS, the dramatic tenfold rise in acts of terrorism, you conclude that the region is engulfed in violence and instability, and it has tremendous attendant effects on U.S. interests. So why then, when you reflect on the history of our engagement, the consistent results achieved and the moment we're in, why then would we think that doing the same thing would produce a different outcome? And why then would we think that it's possible to sequence the security, the economic reform, the political reform that we all recognize needs to happen in the region versus recognizing that they're highly interdependent factors? And I'll give you a couple of examples to demonstrate the way in which I think these are interdependent factors. So when you look at sort of 3 essential tensions in the region that most experts agree sort of are at the crux of ongoing instability, you look at ascendant youth populations and closed economies. You look at closed political systems and corrupt institutions. You look at injustice and security. And I see all those as 3 categories of contradiction. So returning to the ascendant youth populations and the lack of economic opportunities that they face, again, widely recognized as a source of instability. The technical solutions to fixing these economic problems are clear and have been forever, right? So you need to focus on macroeconomic stability, reducing subsidies, reducing debt. You need to focus on investment climate reforms, greater transparency, rule of law, ease of doing business regulations. So, that's known. And those are, technical solutions that the U.S. government has been trying to address in technical ways. Not just the U.S. government, the World Bank, all the international institutions. The technical solutions are available. The competencies in those countries are available. So why aren't these reforms taking place? Why isn't that happening? And fundamentally, it's because the economic structure of these countries benefit powerful constituencies and elites. And those powerful constituencies and elites have few incentives to take up the reforms that would alter these closed economies that benefit the few, such that they're economies that benefit the many. The incentives for that are not available. And I'll give you a stark example. Egypt takes up 8 pages in your report and is, the bane of all of our existences. But when you look at Egypt and you consider the military's engagement in the economy, something that is infrequently talked about or insufficiently talked about in our policy circles. But let's think about the military's privileges in the economy. They have total privileged access to non-transparent procurement and public works. They have free access to all undeveloped agricultural land. They access below market labor. They're the principal recipients of major input subsidies. They have installed generals at all levels of Egypt's institutions. And as is often said about the Egyptian military, the business of the Egyptian military is business. And so when you look at the privileges and the reach into the economy, and then you consider the fact that they have their hands on the political, right? Presidency operating without a parliament for nearly a year now. They have their hands on the political levers of the country. They have their hands on the economic levers of the country. And they have their levers on the security levers of the country. Where are the incentives supposed to come from for them to give up some of these privileges in the economy that they accrue to themselves and to privileged elites? So when you look at the sum total of that impact on Egypt's economy, you look at the fact that the military and privileged firms associated with the regime receive 80% of the input subsidies, receive over 90% of the loans made available to business, and account for 11% of employment. The impact of that is that 70% of Egypt's employment opportunities are happening in the informal sector. The impact on ordinary Egyptians is unbelievable in that you have Egyptians who toil endlessly to eke out sort of daily living, right? They're mom and pops trying to survive on a day-by-day basis, but they're not generating wealth. They're not passing anything on to future generations. Their businesses aren't growing. They're not employing more people. They're just stuck. And they've been that way for a long time. And you start to understand how those populations can begin to chafe at regimes that privilege elites and that have developed extractive, rent-seeking institutional structures that take from populations in the region, but fundamentally are not citizen-facing. They don't exist to serve citizens. And that is a fundamental aspect to the ongoing instability. It's why these struggles for power and resources become so zero-sum. I'll give you a second example, institutional reform. So when you look across institutions in the region, they rank in the bottom 20% for institutional quality of most countries in the world. So that's looking at the Global Competitiveness Index. And I think one of the starkest examples is when you look again at Egypt, it places dead last in the quality of the management of their educational institutions. dead last, 144th out of countries. So they're performing so much more poorly even than a range of developing country peers. And that's in the face of billions of dollars of U.S. investment on education, health, water and sanitation, various aspects intended to serve the needs of populations. So I want to emphasize this point that the solutions to these problems are not technical. They're not necessarily about additional foreign assistance resources in education and health and various other kinds of public works. They're fundamentally about changing the incentives for reform. Changing the incentives for reform are about democratic process, democratic institutions. The solutions to these problems are not security solutions or technical solutions. They're political solutions that rest in the domestic politics of these countries. So, the job of transforming those domestic economies and the domestic political structures and taking on the transformations necessary to address the significant challenges are with them and with those citizens and with those leaders, but there's a role the U.S. has to play as a catalyst, and we have to play it because it's central to achieving our interests, which, again, should be, nobody should expect any state to take on activities that aren't in their interest. But it's part of the reason why we should be a much stronger advocate for these types of reforms because it's what matters to the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Again, on the last point on institutional quality, the incentives for reform have to come from public accountability. So when you look at the fact that these institutions are closed, that they're shielded from any sort of public accountability, you really start to understand why it is that freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, access to information, those are the essential levers for being able to push back on institutions that are not citizen-facing and will not be citizen-facing until they're forced to be accountable to the citizens that they're supposed to be serving. And until they're accountable and start providing those services, we're going to continue to see these tensions boil over. The last example I would offer is, again, around security institutions, where tactics matter. So when you're deploying tremendous amounts of security assistance into countries where regimes lack due process, engage in mass trials and mass sentencing, where security forces are unaccountable, where their tactics fundamentally foment greater violence and instability, that makes us complicit in what those security institutions are doing. It makes us complicit in the oppression that is resulting in ever greater extremism, and it gets in the way of us being able to achieve our goals on countering violent extremism, on countering terrorism, and achieving security and stability. So last I said I'd talk a little bit about how it could change. And fundamentally on how it could change is about, that's about recognizing our leverage. So the U.S. leverage is a huge debate in the policy community. Do we have it or not? And I think what's really interesting about, Steve, what you said at the outset when you're talking about, the resistance to push back against regimes who are cooperating with us on our security strategy in the region. What does that cooperation amount to? Who's taking on the majority of those burdens? How many U.S. troop lives have been lost in the region? What do you estimate is the proportion of the security effort that's being undertaken by the U.S. compared to any of our allies in the region? Upwards of 90%. So is there a reason for us to hold back on the obligations we might impose on our security partners, the conditions we might impose on our security partners for the fact that the U.S. primarily provides the security umbrella for the region? ISIS is first and foremost a threat to the regimes in the region. Its aims are in conquering and maintaining territory. Its aims are in overthrowing regimes in the region and establishing their own regime, their own state in its place. It's not fundamentally, an existential threat to the United States in the way that it's an existential threat to regimes in the region. So they care about what we're doing. They care about what we're providing. And we ought to think about altering an approach that's been decades of providing essential security assurances to the region without asking regimes to take on some of the fundamental domestic reforms that will reduce the need for that type of intervention. So a big piece is using that leverage in ways that we haven't been, and understanding that that leverage isn't in the dollars. So, in the policy discussions that we often were a part of, it's about, can we use $250 million of ESF to get Egypt to sign an IMF agreement? Like, that's not where our leverage is. $250 million of ESF is not the difference. In Tunisia, we're all excited that, there's been such an increase in support, but $134 million is not the difference between success and failure in Tunisia, and it's not the basis of any sort of fundamental leverage in encouraging Tunisia to undertake ongoing reforms. Where that leverage lies is in being able to deploy approaches that recognize the root causes of the constraints in Tunisia, and that offer a range of incentives that are far beyond just our aid, that extend to a range of economic and security cooperation that really lays out some options for Tunisia to take on the fundamental reforms that it needs to take. I'll give you a tiny example. Several years ago now, the Tunisians, in conjunction with the U.S. government and the African Development Bank, undertook a real analysis of their economy. It's the constraints to growth analysis that the Millennium Challenge Corporation does. The benefit of that analysis is that it takes the 300 things that you might need to do in the context of a developing country or a middle-income country that's struggling with a closed economy, and highlights sort of the 3 things that are essential to do if you really want to open up your economy. As in, if you don't do those 3 things, nothing else is going to work. Your technical assistance isn't going to work, your entrepreneurship programs aren't going to work, your ICT program isn't going to work. Like, those 3 things need to happen. And interestingly, Tunisia, those 3 things were corruption and lack of transparency in their financial institutions, and the rigidity of their labor market. And so that was lack of transparency, 1, corruption, 2, and the rigidity of their labor markets. Those were the fundamental constraints in Tunisia, and the opportunity we had at hand was that the Tunisians recognized it. They signed off on that report. They were, we created stakeholders within the Tunisian regime for addressing those issues. But what we didn't do next is offer them some opportunities to be able to counter elites within their own institutions that would push back on those kinds of reforms. So, we've done 2 big loan guarantees for Tunisia. There may be opportunities for those in the future. That's contributed to $1 billion that they raised on private markets. What may have the outcomes have been if we had linked those loan guarantees with some technical assistance to fundamental reforms that the Tunisians were willing to take on in their economy? So the leverage of $1 billion, very different than the leverage of $55 million that we're offering in bilateral assistance, and the opportunities there to follow the Tunisians' lead and taking reforms that they already wanted to take was an opportunity lost. So last, a little bit about what it would take. And I think what I see in this report when I read between the lines is tremendous divisions between within the executive branch, within the legislative branch, and then between them. And I think that those divisions and that lack of consensus on the fact basis for what's happening in the region, the lack of consensus around our strategic approaches, the outcomes that we need to achieve and how we need to achieve them, that lack of consensus creates tremendous opportunities for actors in the region to divide and conquer among us. It results in tremendous incoherence in being able to deploy a sustained strategy that would have some difference. Cole talked about that when he talked about the approach on withholding the assistance to Egypt. When there are so many half measures, You know, when there are so many half measures, when rhetoric does not align with actions, it just creates opportunities for actors in the region to secure their interests at the expense of ours. So I think, you know, really focusing on ability to develop and deploy a coherent and sustained new strategy for the region is a step the U.S. government, in consultation and with the support of the Congress, needs to take to really turn the ship on what's been a failed engagement in the region.
Okay. Thanks very much. Tom, you get the opportunity of following those remarks.
Wow, it's going to be hard to do. Naz is so smart and so well-spoken. I think she's laid out a very persuasive case for improving U.S. policy here.
I'd love to be on panels with
But let me start with praise for POMED and the Heinrich Boll Foundation first. As was noted, this is the 8th annual version of this report, and it has evolved over the years through the very interactive method that they use to put it together, consulting with key officials in multiple parts of the U.S. government and on Capitol Hill and around town and around the region. So it evolves year by year, it becomes smarter also, it becomes more nuanced, and it becomes a more useful reference. Because how we spend our money here in Washington, in the United States government, is how we show how much we care about something, and it's an important measure of our commitment and our policy priorities. So this has become a very important document, and it does generate a lot of discussion inside the U.S. government. I can now tell you, having been in there for 4.5 years recently, this is a key reference in internal deliberations across the government dealing with the Middle East region. But I also want to point out something important about the Heinrich Boll Foundation, which provided support to POMED for this. Think about what I just said. A German political party foundation spending German taxpayer money gave a grant to an advocacy organization in Washington to research and publish a report that's critical of U.S. policy. This is the kind of thing that could get you thrown out of a lot of the countries we're talking about here. And so it's important to note that that in the United States at least, NGOs are allowed to take grants from foreign enterprises and use them to put out reports that criticize the government here and point out its shortcomings and its failures. So I want to congratulate Heinrich Boll for doing that and POMED for doing their part in this. But I was also wondering this morning about Heinrich Boll. I know this is the Green Party Foundation, and so I did a little reading this morning about Heinrich Boll, after whom the foundation is named. Most of the people in this room probably know that he was the 1972 winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. I want to quote what I found on my favorite online encyclopedia about his work. It says that his books, in a number of his books, there are protagonists who are stubborn and eccentric individualists opposed to the mechanisms of the state and of public institutions. Like you guys. The summary of his work goes on to say that villains in Boll's work are usually figures of authority in government and elsewhere, whom he castigates, sometimes humorously, sometimes acidly, for what he perceived as their conformism, lack of courage, self-satisfied attitude, and abuse of power. So it sounds like it's a perfect marriage of the Heinrich Boll Foundation, inspired by the great German author, to enable a troublemaking group like POMED to put out this annual report. I think Heinrich Boll would be pleased that the foundation is doing this. We certainly are grateful, and we benefit from it as well. Because facts are facts, and the numbers that are the basis of this analysis and the cool graphics that they produce that show trends year by year and over the years do provide a different light on what people are doing around town, sometimes not always fully aware of what the implications of 100 different separate decisions are going to add up to and what they look like until you see it in a handsome report like this. So thanks again for the report and its genesis. The second point I want to make is to talk about the securitization of U.S. foreign policy that is at the center of this presentation by Steve and Cole, and of this analysis that shows that even in the last 4 years, more of the assistance to the region has gone into the security side of the account. Was it up from 76 to 79% or something like that over these last few years? While the corresponding amounts for democracy, good governance, and other kinds of things to build civilian capacity and people's voices has accordingly diminished. This security focus of U.S. foreign policy is, and of development policy, it has to be said, is a reality, and it's also a necessity. I think that's what we have to come to grips with. While lamenting this at one level, we also have to understand it, and we have to integrate this discussion into this security-centered approach to the region. Naz has laid out a powerful argument for why some of our security engagements have not accomplished the security goals they have been advertised to. But I think the larger challenge for us, those of us who have been inside government and those who are outside of government, is to make the case stronger, more strongly, and to connect the dots between about how a stronger civil society, how more democratic governance, how a more interactive, transparent, responsive kind of government in each of these different countries would lead to more secure countries and a more secure region, and ultimately, therefore, would cost the U.S. taxpayer and government less money and fewer lives lost. I think making this promotion of democracy in the Middle East a national security argument is something that some of us tried to do when we were in the secure conference rooms and in these meetings, but obviously we failed to make the case persuasively enough. So we're going to need to continue as people outside the government, people knowledgeable about the region, working with partners in the region, to continue to make the case for why more democratic governance in the Middle East, better respect for human rights, justice, and dignity would make for a more secure operating environment. Because too often they're seen as alternatives. And I think we need to get beyond, we need to embrace this challenge and elevate our game so that we can point out that most of the security challenges that we face in the Middle East and even more broadly in the world arise from either ungoverned spaces or from repressive regimes. They directly arise from democratic deficits. And too often that connection is not made by the people who are focused most on the short-term, seemingly existential threats that arise from something as horrific as the marauding, metastasizing Islamic State as it careens across Syria and Iraq and perhaps one day beyond. I mean, just in the last few days, as we've seen the fall of two major cities, one in Syria, one in Iraq, Ramadi and Palmyra, to this army kind of ennobles it, this mob of killers, has to galvanize all of us to both appreciate the intensity and the immediacy of the security threat, and also to be able to make this larger argument about how this phenomenon has emerged as a direct result of poor government, unresponsive government, incompetent, ineffective government that comes when there are no democratic accountability mechanisms. So that's a challenge that we all share, and one that we're going to have to continue to work on to connect the dots here more successfully going forward. I want to talk then a little bit about a couple of the things in the report, particularly the policy language discussion that I think Steve and Cole divided between them. First, on the language that inserts into the proposal to the Congress for the assistance legislation, a waiver option for the termination of assistance to governments that are replaced by coups. I certainly appreciate the anxiety that was expressed about how waivers can be used, but I do want to remind people that it is not as stark as I think was presented here. In fact, in the report, the language is, in the last paragraph of the discussion of Section 7008, it says, as is the case with other laws containing national security waivers, the executive branch routinely exercises such waivers in a manner that effectively renders the requirements in U.S. law meaningless. And I just don't think that's true. I think that's sometimes true, but I don't think it's routinely done or always effective in evading the intent of the restriction or the termination clause in the law. And I would point specifically to the provision in law known as the Leahy Amendment that obliges the executive branch to withhold training and equipment from security forces anywhere in the world for whom the government has credible evidence that those units, those security force units, are implicated in gross human rights violations. Now, there's two versions of this law. One applies to the State Department and funding that flows through state, and the other applies to appropriations that go directly to the Defense Department. Interestingly, the Defense Department version of the Leahy law contains a waiver authority, whereas the State Department does not. So you would think that the Pentagon would be tempted to and would do, as the report says, routinely exercise a waiver in a manner that would obviate the implication of the Leahy restriction. But they don't. They've never, ever exercised the waiver authority. The Pentagon and the U.S. government has never exercised the waiver authority that is contained in the defense authorization, or the defense appropriation. Because there's and one of the reasons for that is that there is an ongoing, very interactive discussion between my colleagues, my former colleagues in the State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the Pentagon, and other parts of the State Department, and the folks here on Capitol Hill that are responsible for overseeing implementation of this law. So it's a constant interactive discussion about how the law is being monitored and implemented. Senator Leahy and other colleagues have taken a real interest in how that has worked. Regular briefings are asked for and received, and as is necessary and appropriate over time, funding has been made available to staff positions in the State Department, in DRL, to ensure that the law is effectively implemented. So it's possible that these waivers can be managed in a way that fulfills the wish of those in Congress that have created them, that who have created the policy direction in a termination or a restriction, even when there is a waiver provision in it. So I just want to, as part of the ongoing discussion on this, for next year's report, you might want to evolve that discussion a little bit, and we'll see whether this new version of Section 7008 can be made as interactive and I think ultimately effective as the Leahy law has been. The other discussion was about the Brownback Amendment, or what one might call the Obama language that was presented in the proposal to Congress this year. And again, I think there's another interpretation that I might have preferred or suggested if I was a member of the board of POMED and had a chance to weigh in on this. I think there was an opportunity here to embrace what the administration has proposed and to look more closely at the President's initiative in support of civil society. Twice now at the UN General Assembly, the last two Septembers, President Obama has convened highly visible global gatherings of governments and civil society leaders and elevated the discussion about how we and other governments need to be more vigorous in supporting beleaguered civil society in repressive environments around the world. Moreover, this year, last September, the President also issued and publicly, it's on the website of the White House, it's called a presidential memorandum to all executive branch agencies that do any work internationally. And it's a long list of agencies, including the Pentagon, including Treasury, Commerce, and the State Department, of course, and asks them to elevate their game in the kind of language that's contained in this budget submission that says push back against the crackdown on civil society, do more, do it more often, do it more vigorously, and tell me what you've done. And so there is a process that had begun to ensure that all agencies are going to be reporting back to the White House in due course on how they're implementing the president's guidance to them on this subject. And this version in the budget provision echoes that and is a reflection of that. And so while there's obviously going to be occasions when U.S. government officials will be tempted to withhold support, whether that's financial support or political support, to one or another democratic actor for fear of alienating a partner government, the larger policy, I think, has been made clear. And the effort is to provide better, stronger guidance to those who will be tempted to defer our enduring support for democratic actors in the interests of good working relationships with authoritarian and other non-democratic partner governments. Because, and this may be the last point on language that's reflected in the report, it comes up in several different places throughout. There is a kind of an implicit assumption in a number of passages in this report that there is a kind of enthusiastic embrace of authoritarianism in the executive branch. Page 4 of the report says, countries enlisting in the fight against terrorism have once again been given carte blanche to arrest opposition members, trample freedom of expression and association, and stifle civil society, as if there are officials in the U.S. government who are actively embracing repressive techniques by governments in the region. And having just spent 5 years in the U.S. government, I can tell you I never met an official like that. It's just not true that anybody in our government is giving carte blanche as if it was ours to give, first of all. But there's certainly nobody who would, if they could, say to a partner government, go for it. That just doesn't happen. So I think that, and there are not just people like Nazanin and others who have been in high places in the government who have made these cases internally for more forward-leaning postures toward support for people who share our values and to push back against necessary partners who don't share our values. The conversations are more about what would be effective, how can we do it, what are the trade-offs, what are the costs to other parts of our engagement or our relationship. I just honestly have never met someone who said, this is a good thing these governments are doing. Everybody knows the nature of these governments, the counterproductive nature of some of these repressive policies. And so the challenge is really how to, again, to go back to where I started a few moments ago, how to connect the dots between how bad decision-making, repressive behavior by partner governments contributes to their insecurity and ultimately to ours, raises our costs financially and in military terms and in the cost in lives of our young men and women. Making that connection more effectively, more persuasively in the policy discussion, I think is something that that argument can be made. People are willing to hear it. They want us to make the case. And again, as I said, I wasn't successful yet in most cases in making that argument. So I need to take advantage of my time out of government to kind of reboot and get smarter, as Nazanin obviously has done in her few months out of government, and be able to make that case more persuasively as we go forward. Because I think it's doable. Ultimately, it has to be done if we're to be successful in supporting these countries as they move towards stability, shared prosperity, and being better partners for us in the wider world. Lastly, just very briefly, let me say I appreciate the good words in the report and in the presentations about the work in my former part of the State Department in DRL. I think it does have a different angle on things than USAID and embassies, but it's important to underscore that it works hand in glove with USAID and embassies in country and the Middle East Bureau in the case of this region. so that whatever you like about DRL, some of the praise and glory has to spill over onto some of the other actors who are part of the shared decision-making on a lot of the grant-making and a lot of the other initiatives. And the same goes, it's a different case for the National Endowment for Democracy. You also in the report point to the NED's unique role in supporting political actors and civil society and watchdog groups in a lot of countries, unencumbered by the boundaries that confine USAID or even the State Department in various ways. The NED remains the best money in the business, in my opinion, because it's so fungible, it's so flexible, and it can be done in amounts large and small. So it's good that that continues to be funded robustly by the Congress, and just as DRL's budget typically gets enlarged as it goes through the congressional appropriations process, one can only praise the wisdom of the elected members of the Congress and their smart staff for improving on what they get from the executive branch in the submissions. So I guess I will leave it there and turn it back over to our chairman.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'll just very briefly respond to one of your points, and then open the floor to questions. We have another half an hour for questions and discussion. First, I don't think Cole and I were intending to suggest that U.S. government officials are encouraging political repression, or that U.S. officials or people here on Capitol Hill want to see that. I think it's clear that U.S. government would prefer to see more open governments in many cases, and less repressive governments, less abusive of their citizens' rights. But language that we use, such as giving carte blanche, isn't that the U.S. government is encouraging that or welcoming it, but not standing up against it. And when there are governments whose primary external backer is the United States government, and when the vast majority of our aid to the region is military assistance to these repressive governments, and we then choose to not kind of stand up against these actions, and we don't see U.S. government praise for political repression, but when we see praise for these governments that are politically repressive, and in the absence of strong criticism, that is widely interpreted by some of these governments and certainly by their citizens as this sort of carte blanche and support. We've seen numerous statements from U.S. officials at the highest levels, including statements like from Secretary Kerry, who referred to President Sisi as restoring democracy in Egypt. We've seen praise for the Egyptian government very recently, sort of more enthusiastic support for the Egyptian government at the recent economic investment conference than we've seen, for example, for Tunisia. And so there's a often widespread perception that this support, although it isn't explicitly praising or supporting repression, essentially is, when it comes from the United States, is basically at least allowing that or not standing up against it. I'd like to open the floor now to questions from the audience. If you could also briefly state your name and affiliation before asking your question, that would be great. And I believe we have microphones that are coming around. So any questions from the floor? Yeah, we'll start here in the front.
Matt Peets, I'm the Director for Civil Society for FY16, an independent nonprofit largely funded by USAID and state here in DC. Thanks for an excellent report and a fascinating panel. I have a question about the analysis of the funding of OMEP and then the Middle East Regional Office, which follows it. Full disclosure, I just came from working on an OMEP-funded project in Cairo. So you note that there's a jump from $5 million that OMEP was getting annually to $40 million requested by MERO. OMEP had a focus where their programming had to be regional. It had to focus in 2 countries or more at once, which I think is often a challenge when it actually comes out to rolling out programs and activities. Do you have an indication of whether MERO's activities will have to be the same? Will they have to have some kind of regional remit? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, generally, I think a lot of the programming is still going to be regional in nature. One of the sort of interesting things with this increased funding line is that it's also sort of shifting to different kinds of activities. When we first talked about the OMEP office in FY09, we were a bit critical that, there wasn't really much of a support or sort of focus on DNG. Out of the 40 million requested this year, about 8 million of that should be for democracy and governance. So there's more of a focus on there. Two other quick things I'd mention is that this Middle East regional account line will also support an office that's been set up in Frankfurt, which provides a lot of regional backstopping support to different countries in the region. And also, frankly, in countries where there's been evacuated personnel and staff, particularly in Libya, likely soon in Yemen, Lebanon, and so on, that it provides sort of a base for them to continue their operations. The last thing is that out of that 40, there's also 5 million set aside. The memo that Tom mentioned from the president's speech on civil society also laid out plans for civil society innovation centers around the world. And 5 million of that funding is intended to support this kind of center for the Middle East.
Ziad Touzani I'm fellow at the Foreign Policy Initiative think tank. My question will be like Mrs. Ash was talking about the support for some countries like Tunisia. Like they had just allocated 55 million and you said maybe 1 billion will be much better. And I quote you like it's an opportunity lost. So how do you explain that? Like I'm sure there is a great moral support for countries like Tunisia, but concretely, on action, we don't really see things happening.
Thank you so much for your question. First, to clarify, what I wanted to note is that the opportunity that we lost was when we provided 2 rounds of loan guarantees that allowed Tunisia to raise $1 billion on private capital markets, but we didn't require. We didn't use that opportunity to apply any conditions precedent that might encourage them to address constraints in their economy. So it was sort of, $1 billion with the missed opportunity to use that leverage to encourage some reforms in their economy. Similarly, going forward with the 55 million, what I think is a lost opportunity there is not just in the amount, because as I said, I'm not sure that even if you doubled what they were offering or quadrupled what the US government is offering in financial assistance to Tunisia, that's not going to be the difference to its failure or its success. It's about how you use those resources. And if you use those resources as sort of a straight $55 million of economic support and you put it into programming, and you put it into technical programs, service delivery, technical assistance delivery, training, if you put it into those technical vehicles without addressing the fundamental constraints to an open economy in Tunisia, it's not going to lead to Tunisia's transformation. So it's not just the amount of money, it's how we use that money and what we leverage it for.
Thank you very much. Hisham Jabi at MSI. Thank you very much, Ms. Ash, for raising the issue of youth. With the youth bulge in the world at large, and the Middle East in particular, this is a serious, major challenge for the whole region. You have 340 million people, half of them, probably 60% of the population below the age of 35, little opportunities. But I just want to, economic opportunities, but I want to articulate also that the issue is not only related to economic opportunities and employment. Very, very critical. You ask yourself a question: what does attract a young Tunisian or Yemeni guy to go leave everything behind and join ISIS in Syria? I've been asking this question again and again across the whole region. The issue is very complex. There are grievances, there are the issue of peer-to-peer sense of belonging, the issue of complex at the level of even family. You know, the issue of the intergenerational dialogue and engagement is lacking. Then you ask your question, what does ISIS provide for these young people that we never succeeded to provide? Right. The sense of belonging, sense of engagement, sense of empowerment is lacking in most of the programming. And I believe that's a message for people in Washington, policymakers, that the way we have been supporting civil society is not working. We have been circulating the money again and again within group of elitist organization. We are not putting efforts to outreach to indigenous on the front line people who are doing the real thing and the real engagement. I mean, I was in Tunis recently. I was in the capital. Everything sounds okay until I went to the rural areas. It's unbelievable. More than 5,000 Tunisian young people are joined ISIS, and the number is growing. So I think we need to really look at a comprehensive way of how can we engage second and third layer of civil society organization in the Middle East to outreach to young people and empower them beyond economic opportunities only. So I'd like to hear your comment. Thank you.
Thank you again so much, and you're so right to emphasize that it's not just about economic opportunities, it's also just about a sense of dignity and being able to fulfill your potential. And I didn't do a great job of articulating that in my remarks, but it's really what I meant to convey when I sort of made this point, that you're not generating wealth, you're not creating the circumstances that are sort of the definition of development progress, which is that each generation do better than the one that came before. Like, that's just not something that can happen. And so when you're a young person in many of these countries, if you're not a member of the privileged elite, you really question where your opportunities are going to come from. You know, how you really question the control you have over your future and your ability to be able to respond to your and fulfill your aspirations. And that's, again, fundamentally about economies being closed to you and politics being closed to you. You don't have an opportunity. You don't have an opportunity to influence these major aspects that will determine your life and your ability to fulfill your ambitions. You had inspired something else that now I've lost the thread on. I wanted to, so your point about the way we engage with civil society, and I think it's a really interesting one. And I think, there's so much conversation about how we struggle in closed space, right? And then you sort of, I think an interesting counterpoint is the way in which ISIS has been able to organize and promulgate its message in closed spaces. And, so there are methods available for allowing citizens to aggregate and elevate and amplify their voices and their grievances in ways that will create pressure on elites to reform. And we have done an insufficient job of finding and supporting those more creative methodologies that may indeed be much more about supporting citizen movements through a variety of platforms, including social media, and maybe less about support to individual organizations that are increasingly constrained, although it remains critically important to do that as well. So you think about things like, the I Paid a Bribe campaigns that have been so successful in South Asia, methods that allow for citizens to consistently describe their institutional experiences and the corruption that they chafe against every day, and to elevate that in a way that represents a threat to existing elites. Again, when you look at the literature, when closed regimes and when closed institutions have finally opened up and shared and become citizen-facing institutions and have given up a little of their privileges in order for others to have more, it's been when they faced existential threats. That's what we saw in 2011, existential threats to existing regimes because of mass citizen movements.
Nader Tadros, Solidarity Center. With what you have described and we have all seen is that this is too expensive for us to continue kind of supporting. This is kind of an abusive relationship, this is how I like to describe it, between the governments that know that they are too powerful and know that we are too much keen on having this relationship, and what we have, the price that we have to pay. And it's too expensive for everybody, including those countries and the citizens there. At the same time, we are stuck in a short-term versus a long-term vision with the election cycles, and so we are stuck there. And I don't know how to carry that message, and I know that you tackled this too. How far can we go? Do you think that if we go far enough, and are we willing to take a rift between us and those countries? Because this is likely what's going to happen when they feel like there is a threat to their existence, as you said. How far do you think we can go with that relationship?
Well, I think you've described the dilemma pretty well. There are limits in almost all these cases, notwithstanding all of the comradely language that comes up on diplomatic occasions. Both sides know that there are limits to the depth of our relationship that arise from their hostility towards our values and our policies. That while we are transacting certain arrangements for security or other needs, that there is a fundamental absence of a shared vision, a shared sense of purpose, of the kind that exists with other governments in other parts of the world. Our relationships with much of the Americas, with Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. Those are relationships that are deep and rich and mutually beneficial because we share economies, we share values, we have similar political systems, and we don't have that in most of the Middle East. We have very transactional, short-term relationships that are not fundamentally built on a shared vision of each other, ourselves, and the world around us. So that will always put limits on these relationships, and it makes it all the more difficult for us all to make that long-term argument, connecting the dots to the recurring need for short-term assurance and short-term security fixes to endemic problems. Naz described very vividly the economic dysfunctions in Egypt and how, and even in Tunisia, how certain short-term things we try to do to help don't address the longer-term underlying structural problems that mean that these problems will inevitably recur. So that's true in multiple dimensions. How we can get to that while the house is burning. Again, that goes back to the security moment. While the house is on fire, we're being asked to improve the furniture arrangements in the living room. And it's just never going to happen that way. People are always going to want to put out the fire first and deal with the furniture arrangements later. But if the fire keeps recurring, and it's in the kitchen one time, it's in the backyard the next, it's in the basement the next time, it never stops. And that's the kind of dysfunctional cycle that we, closed loop that we find ourselves in.
That's right. If I can add a couple points to that. Tom appropriately lays out the context in which these decisions and trade-offs and negotiations take place. It's houses on fire. And so it's a constant struggle around the short term versus the long term. I'm interested, though, in the space in between. So as we are providing, as we are enhancing security cooperation relationships, as we are providing additional security assurances, as we are tripling security assistance to Tunisia, again, how are we deploying that in some portion with an understanding that it needs to be deployed with, the reform of those very same security institutions in mind, because again, their tactics matter. So, what are the opportunities to deploy our assistance in a way that coexists with an assessment of security institutions, the things that need to change, what we're willing to provide to both assist with that change and incentivize it, and so that we are much more cognizant of the use of the assistance we provide and the such that we elevate the strategies that security institutions are using and provide strong incentives for reform. The last thing you said that really stuck with me was sort of you talked about sort of what are the limits, what are the risks we're willing to take, and I guess my initial answer to that is let's find out, so because it's not an approach that we have taken in the past. We've been extremely risk averse, and I think that the debate around Egypt's security assistance really demonstrates that and is remarkable to me. So here we look at a country like Egypt, again, where, actually, we have big questions about the capabilities of their security institutions, both internally and with respect to, their military. So their internal security forces and their military pose real questions for us about their capabilities, right? And what began at, and so here's a security, and we need them to be strong security partners. That's in our interest, that's in Egypt's interest, that's in our allies' interest. So we need them to be stronger security partners. But it's taken us this long to say, actually, we're providing the billions of dollars of security assistance, and we want to be sure that those billions of dollars of security assistance address the threats that you face today: counterterrorism, border security, Sinai security, maritime security. Those are the present threats of the day. Why would we be deploying U.S. tax dollars for threats that are in our interest and in their interest different from those? That we're not, those are the threats. And it's been such a struggle to say we're going to turn the ship to focus on our mutual interests. Why is that a struggle? Similarly, with cash flow financing, making the change in cash flow financing is so important, not only because of the leverage it affords us to make changes in our foreign policy and strategy when we need to, right? So because we haven't, what's the word I'm looking for? We haven't sort of committed ourselves, on billions of dollars years into the future that makes it really hard to turn the ship when threats change. So the other reason cash flow financing is so important is because it's been the foundation of the military-industrial complex that has become, Egypt's military and the way it's engaged in the country. So reducing cash flow financing is a way to take the thumb off the scale, to Tom's original point. It's a way to take the thumb off the scale of the security approaches and to create space for civilian leadership to emerge.
Hi, Jennifer Watley with World Learning. Tom, you talked about the difficulty of connecting the dots and making that argument within the U.S. government. And I think a lot of times in the DG sector, we sort of look at the health sector and envy them because they can make that direct connection between vaccinations and reducing infections and other things. And in the DG sector, we struggle with that. I'm wondering from your perspective and from Nazinan's perspective, how can we make that argument more effectively, and what kind of evidence or what kind of information do those of us who are implementing DG programs and working on these issues, what do we need to be gathering in order to help the advocates within the U.S. government connect those dots and make that argument more effectively?
Well, one thing we can do is point to developmental successes in various parts of the world, because this is as bleak as the prospects for political, economic, social development in parts of the Middle East sometimes seem. The world has seen actual improvements in other parts of the world, and I think we need to look to some other transition environments where the arrival of more open democratic politics has been accompanied by an increasingly shared prosperity and better outcomes on other development metrics as well. And you look at places from Indonesia to South America to parts of Africa, that, there are cases we can point to where more democratic governments have become better partners and become more competent because they are trying to be more responsive to their peoples. So it's not like this is a purely theoretical notion that is being put out there. It may seem that way sometimes in Middle East discussions because there is a kind of insularity to the Middle East discussions in the government and in certain circles around the government because the experts on the Middle East know a lot about the Middle East, but they don't tend to know as much about what has happened in other parts of the world. And I think we need to, again, this is a challenge for those of us in and out of government alike, is to be able to cross-pollinate a little better with some of the success stories that do exist around the world.
Tom, your comments about on the sort of lack of positive examples in the Middle East and North Africa, that it's important to look to other regions, which I agree with. I would also just add that I think that only heightens the importance of the potential positive example that we now have in Tunisia. It's not fully there yet, but if Tunisia can move forward, not only with consolidating its democratic transition, but also having economic success accompany the political progress that we've seen, I think it could be very powerful, not only in the region, but also for those who work on the region here in Washington to have positive example and model to point to that would influence our engagement with other countries in the region. Thanks again to all of you for coming and joining us, and please join me in thanking our guest speakers as well.